I've had many supernatural experiences, but this one was very different from all the others. The horror from that night sticks with me to this day, and I often wonder if I'm due a repeat experience. I often vacation at a relative's summer home at a small lake in the woods that feeds from Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. It's what you'd expect from a tiny census-designated place along a 50-mile stretch of north to south highway. It's comprised of mostly tiny bungalows and summer houses, some antique stores and old barns, some grocery stores, and some bars. My family had visited the town for a week or two every summer since I could remember. I know the immediate area like the back of my hand, but it's still easy to get lost on those dirt back roads and end up in the thick of Maine's woods accidentally. Several years ago I was vacationing at the lake house and I was still awake at around 2 a.m. I was feeling kind of restless and not quite ready for bed, so I decided to go outside for a cigarette. So I walked down to the dock to smoke it. Try to picture this in your head. The cabin surrounded by trees on an old dirt road. The back door to the house opens to the dock, which is down a short but rather steep rocky hill. From the dock you can see almost the entire way around the lake. While there are immediate houses nearby, most of them remain unoccupied for the majority of the summer. I could see a light or two visible way across the lake, and the imposing shadow of the island about a half-mile ahead of me. The lights from faraway cars would twinkle at the far end of the lake where the highway led to the real closest town. But everything was very dark and very quiet. As I was standing there smoking, like I had a dozen times before, I felt my skin start to crawl. There was nothing apparent that could have caused it to happen, but I was struck by a sense of ill at ease. Without looking, I started to feel very strongly as though something was staring at me from a tree on my left, about 100 yards away. But when I turned to look at it directly, it was gone, almost as though it anticipated the movement of my head turning and was able to move quickly. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, and I convinced myself that I was only scaring myself. There was nothing there. I continued smoking my cigarette. Then I caught the movement again. In order to move my peripheral vision in line with the tree where I sensed the movement, I started backing up slowly from the dock. This was the last vacation I had with my family before I got married. I thought it was one of my brothers playing a prank on me. Step by step, without turning my head, I backed up and turned my eyes to the extreme right. Now I saw something for sure behind the fire pit and some bushes. Knowing that it was one of my brothers, I nearly broke for a run toward it, but for some reason I hesitated. Instead of running towards it, I fixated my peripheral vision on it. What I saw was not my brother. It was a short, dark person, hairless, with large almond-shaped eyes, and it was holding something. Slowly, I saw it lift a slender arm and reach towards me, a finger outstretched, as if to indicate, "He's the one." Now, I didn't believe that aliens exist then, and I don't necessarily believe they do now. All I know is that what I saw was actually there, and not a result of drug or alcohol use. I hadn't had anything to drink that day, and I'm not a drug user. I blinked my eyes twice, and the thing remained, still and unquiet, holding a strange device to its chest and pointing at me. More curious than scared at this point, but with adrenaline pumping so hard that my temples hurt, I turned around quickly. My plan was to walk calmly back into the house, but when I turned I sensed a flurry of movement from behind perhaps a dozen or more trees, in the woods beyond the house. The woods were full of them, anticipating my every movement, watching me but taking care that I could never get a close look at them. I decided that I had no choice but to book it. As I bolted, I could tell I was being chased very quickly, and from all sides. The crunch of leaves from the ground below me was utterly deafening. I got to the porch and stopped, turning around quickly enough to see the bald grey heads of my pursuers ducking just out of view. The woods had assumed an unearthly quiet that I have never before experienced. No crickets, no wildlife, no water lapping, no loons calling. I scrambled into the door and slammed it. Ever since we were children, my brother was interested in alien encounters. I remember him reading those creepy Whitley Strieber books as a kid. I planned on waking him up and asking for his help, but when I got into the house, my mind went blank. I don't remember walking up the stairs to bed. I never woke up my brother. The next morning, the sun filtering through the window, I noticed that I still had my clothes on. My brother told me the next day he'd seen a light hovering over the lake the previous night. In spite of the strangeness of the situation, he felt entranced by it, as though he couldn't look away. He'd forgotten about it until I told my experience to him. We decided to go out the next night with flashlights to check it all out, but we didn't find anything. We did feel vaguely as though we were being watched for the rest of our trip, however, a feeling that in subsequent visits to the cabin we haven't been able to shake. My manager's a funny fellow, but sometimes he can be straight out weird. Not in a creepy way, but at any given moment he can have a sort of bipolar moment. For example, one minute he can be talking about how lovely his daughters are, and the next minute he could get very emotionally upset when you talk back to him. Anyhow, he showed me this pretty cool game on his phone called Heaven and Earth, and I would play it occasionally with him. One of these occasions I asked him a random question. I asked if he's ever seen a UFO, and almost immediately he responded with, "I don't want to talk about it." I thought it was silly, but I respected his answer. Then he replied again with, "Maybe some other time," to which I was very excited. Frankly, I have never seen a UFO, but after watching movies like The Fourth Kind and countless dreams where I've encountered UFOs in my front yard, I both fear them and am intrigued by them. Later in the week we both had the same hours, so I bring it up subtly, but he gives me the look where he really doesn't want to talk about it, and I'm like, damn. So I let it go, but then once again, when I think it's a lost cause, he just starts telling me the story. He started saying, "I once lived with a buddy up in mine in Michigan, in a secluded little town. Now I only stayed with him for about a week because I was visiting him, and he had been a long-time friend before we strayed apart. One night while he was working the graveyard shift at this gas station, that was the last one before a long straightaway of road that went to the next town, but was completely empty. The surrounding area was dense woods and nothing else, so he always worked in an isolated area. My friend and I sat behind the counter, which was in the front part of the shop, and it's not too crazy to get people to come in late at night, which it was midnight at this point. So we were just chilling, and then a customer walks in and goes straight to the back of the store where the drinks are. My friend Josh greets him, and the customer replies by complimenting the clear night. Now first off, when the guy came in, he just gave off waves of creepiness. He wore all black, and had darker than black hair, and a really pale face. Really pale. He grabbed his beverage and walked over to the counter, and Josh started ringing up his drink. He starts talking to us again about the weather and how nice it is, and we both agree. He exchanges his money and walks around us to the exit, saying goodbye as we wave him off into the night. A minute passed before we realized what had just happened. Josh looks at me with a concerned face, and I was probably doing the same to him too. The guy, the entire conversation, hadn't opened his mouth the whole time. But he wasn't mumbling his words. I heard him audibly, as you would with any normal person. Josh noticed this too. He also said that the way the guy moved around the shop, I don't think he was walking. I don't know why we didn't notice this before. We both ran out of the shop to look at the end of the road, because it stretched for miles and you could see brake lights going either way. Strangely, we looked both directions, and impossibly there were no lights, which either this guy could have drove a mile a second, or he didn't have a car, which is entirely unlikely as this place is in the middle of nowhere. An hour passed and we calmed down a bit. I said to him I was going to go ahead and go. It was 1 o'clock and I was getting really tired. I said my goodbyes and left. I got in my car and started to drive back to his apartment. It couldn't have been a few minutes, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't speeding, but some police lights showed up in my rearview mirror. I slowed to a stop, and as proper procedure in Michigan, I bent down to reach for my registration, which I keep in my glove compartment. I pulled it out and got back up, but the lights were gone. I turned around and there was no car. Maybe I got lucky. Then I looked at the time. I wish I never did. The clock showed 3:33 AM. When I had just left the station it was only 1:25. 2 hours had passed in that time that I bent down and got back up. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only sane thing to do and just finished driving home. But that whole night I couldn't sleep. As tired as I was, my mind couldn't stop thinking. As my manager was finishing the story to me, I was getting ready for a delivery and actually walking out to my car, so he kind of wrapped it up pretty quickly. But in my head, which I told him out loud, "You got abducted, dude. I'm sorry, but you got freaking abducted." He gave me that look he gave me earlier, that "I don't want to talk about it" look, and turned back inside. I got into my car and thought with grimace how much that must have sucked.